Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming so much. I'm going to be getting ready real soon. There's a large number of people just coming in real fast. So in about maybe a few more seconds, I think we're going to get started right about now. Okay, I think we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so hello, everyone. Today's seminar is going to be a little bit more along the lines of trying to do a more general picture for everybody. I know we have some new guests coming in from our previous seminar, as well as many new people coming in who maybe don't even know who my brother or I am. So first, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Albert. I am a long-term college counselor and one of the co-founders of Royal Education. Many of you have interacted with my brother Brian. He's going to be in the back today, kind of working on logistics. And therefore, as a result, today's seminar is mostly going to be about the master plan. And therefore, as a result, we're going to be talking more about the general college application experience and kind of how we as college counselors tend to push students towards a more holistic college counseling experience. So first, we're going to be going into the basics. How does one build a strong student profile? And it's going to be broken down to like 4 major parts, but generally as a whole, we're going to be exploring things with case studies as well later into the actual seminar. But as of this moment, we're going to first start with what kind of activities should my child do? So I'm sure a decent number of students here essentially have their parents there. Number 2, what activities are better to do during the school year? And number 3, what internships, programs, or activities should my child do during the summer? And number 4, should my child participate in research and how can I get such opportunities? Now, duly note though, I know that, for example, that these set of questions are predominantly extracurricular in nature, right? However, duly note though that we do go and explore academics to a certain degree in seminars. However, today's seminar is predominantly around extracurricular activities. So if we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so what kind of activities should my child do? So the real answer to everything, just like we're always going to be saying, you're going to see this answer kind of come up multiple times throughout the entirety of the seminar, is that the answer is different for every student. And this is really important to remember. Every student has a particular set of preferences. This is going to be based off a long existing history and relationship with academic studies, which teachers they've had, what their parents do for a living, as well as, for example, something even as subtle as the fact that they seemingly enjoy watching documentaries, right? So going down to the roots of the basics, essentially, most students can be relatively subdivided into STEM or general liberal arts academics. Now, if we look at the STEM as a case study or look at the STEM as a more or less general idea, we could kind of see that most of the students will generally lean towards medicine or science or business or mathematics. Now, obviously, a significant portion of people will look at business and be along the lines of, hey, maybe that's not exactly a STEM major. But in reality, actually, the vast majority of business-oriented majors tend to lean heavily towards math. Therefore, as a result, in actuality, the vast majority of time, it's actually better to look at business as more of a STEM-oriented major than to look at it as a general liberal arts major. Also, it's very important to think that a student's largest determinant of whether or not it should go into STEM or whether they should go into liberal arts, general learning, or humanities is almost 100% dependent on what they prefer. It's super important to emphasize that, right? It's possible to push a kid to be good at something, but it's a completely different endeavor if they don't like it, right? And therefore, as a result, trying to push a kid that honestly doesn't want to go into medicine is not really the best kind of route for that child. If anything, what ends up happening is there's multiple cases where students essentially push for medicine throughout their younger years, and then because they actually don't like STEM, they don't complete medical school, or they don't even apply by the end of their 4 years in college. Additionally, in other cases like this, many of the humanities majors, such as, for example, pre-law, oftentimes see a lot of burnout like this as well, because sometimes the students will be like, well, sciences are too hard essentially and too competitive, and therefore I don't want to go into that field. So they go into humanities instead and realize, hey, I actually still want to pursue this field. So in reality, what ends up happening is that the number one honest to goodness answer to most people is, what should I study and what activities should I do is almost 100% reflective of what they like. And yes, what they may like at the moment may change as time goes by, but the first thing that we always have to know is that if it does change, you change then. But to try to preemptively predict the change occurring will be relatively useless. So what activities should we do during the school year? Now, here's the thing. The most important thing that we oftentimes tell students is that nothing will be quite as easy to accrue hours with than an activity that's being done at school. And this is something I emphasize again and again with students. Many students do tend to do outside extracurricular activities. First and foremost, many computer science students do almost entirely all their extracurriculars outside of school. However, essentially, if you think about it, an hour every weekday devoted to something that you're going to be doing as extracurricular activity is actually a very, very easy passive way to increase the amount of hours as well as increase the investment they have in that particular activity. This is why, while it may seem a little bit contradictory to go into a class or extracurricular activity that takes up a whole class time away from another AP course, sometimes taking that approach essentially is actually more conducive to a long-term positive outcome, because one, the student may not want to balance 6 APs at once while doing other activities. Maybe balancing 5 APs and doing an extracurricular activity may actually be more holistically better for them. So first thing we oftentimes say is that if there is opportunity that aligns with students' interest, doing an activity that is an extracurricular course in school, essentially, such as student government, journalism, and even sports, essentially, though we can make caveat about that a little bit later, those activities generally tend to be naturally a lot easier for the students to manage. Now, as for other activities like the ones I just mentioned before, one of the most important activities that many students can do is participate in student-run organizations that are very, very strong outside. There's some organizations like this, like Key Club, which is headed by a much larger organization known as Kiwanis. There's other organizations like Youth in Government, Junior State of America, Science Bowl, First Robotics. These things, the type of activities available outside of school ranges widely, depending on the type of activity you want to pursue and whether it's STEM or humanities in general. However, the first thing we do want to state is, yes, while it's possible for a student to do an outside activity, something they built on their own, they generally don't carry as much credence if, for example, they don't have some supporting network of outside adults or other students who are widely available that's participating in the same activity, due to the fact that we look at it for legitimacy purposes. Now, if a student does achieve a lot on their own participant activity that's outside the school, the onus is on them to prove how much they have done. And therefore, as a result, that onus is actually quite difficult to uphold unless the student has done an amazing amount of work that is later affirmed by other adults. We could go into that at a later time if people have questions about this. Now, going outside of during the school time, what internships, programs, or activities should my child do during the summer? Now, first thing, before we even go into all of this, a large number of parents will oftentimes ask, do we need to do stuff over the summer? The answer is yes, if they can afford to do so. And the question of why there's a caveat to that first comes into play when we understand essentially how many things are oftentimes riding on what the student is doing at a summer at any given period of time. The first thing that we have to understand essentially is that at any given period of time, students may be thinking about having to participate in SAT and preparing for that. Students may also be doing summer courses as necessary to be able to qualify for AP courses in the next following semester. At the same time, the student may be doing work or even thinking about participatory credit in classes. There's so many things that can occur at a time period. That doesn't even include professional or pre-professional amateur sports and all these other activities that already occur naturally as a result of the students or what they're already doing at the time period. But one thing is always true. If the student is doing nothing over the summer, something's probably off. And at that point, the common theme that we oftentimes talk about is that students should be doing something within summer that is catered towards a long-term purpose. Now, whether or not they're taking SAT prep or doing something else at the time period is really dependent on the child. Personally, I usually tell people to do SATs a little bit early, but that is 100% dependent on their math level at the moment, as well as their English acquaintance. Additionally, on top of that, whether or not they should be taking courses, whether or not they should be accelerating math or not accelerating is, again, 100% dependent on the student. Therefore, as a result, whether they're taking summer courses at all is, again, another question that is student dependent. So what other activities could there be happening? Now, if the student has done all these things or has considered them or removed them as a possibility, what kind of activities should they be doing? At that point, this is where students generally tend to explore. And in this case, if the student already has a concrete idea about what they want to pursue in the future as their first major, whether they want to pursue a degree in communications and journalism, or whether or not they want to go into medicine, right? At that point, if all other things are done, then the internships and programs they should be focusing on should explore the field that they're thinking about going into. For example, as we see in the bottom, a student interested in majoring or studying English should pursue journalism as activity in school and attend journalism-based activities during the summer. Now, people will oftentimes be like, well, how's journalism kind of dependent on English? The reason for that being essentially is that journalism provides a history of a body of work for an English major to lean back on to show to people in the event that they ask for further evidence of their capacity to write English. Additionally, on top of that, the alternatives essentially, unfortunately, tend to be much harder. An English major may have to be forced to publish work, or to even go so far as to create a book in order to be able to prove their major, but doing so is incredibly difficult due to the difficulty of the editorial process. Therefore, as a result, we oftentimes say, hey, maybe we could have a little bit of an easier process that still provides equal amount of equivalent proof. And therefore, as a result, journalism can provide the kind of evidence-based necessity for an English major to prove their ability to be able to do these things, while also, again, pursuing an activity that allows them to gain leadership points or to do things where they could lead students and therefore, as a result, have further recommendation letter evidence from a teacher that says their body of English work is excellent and they're a fully capable student at that time period. So going into the next part, when should my child participate in research and how can I get such opportunities? Now, I'm sure a decent number of people here have heard about some students participating inside research. Now, the first thing that we oftentimes will say is that, number one, if the student has skills offering them the capacity to pursue research, they should usually do them. To be honest, most of the time they should do them. And therefore, as a result, however, the biggest problem is actually receiving the opportunity to be able to participate in it. And this is where essentially there's a lot of different things that come into play. Number one, essentially, why is research so important? Because it serves as evidence of the fact that they carry research skills. It's rare for students to carry actual hard skills. Most of the time due to college or most of the time due to high school learning curricula, a lot of students actually lack fundamental basics to research ability. Therefore, as a result, they don't know how to research work or read academic literature. A lot of times they don't know actually how to do data or data science work, and therefore, as a result, can't actually accrue the data or interpret it in any manner that's actually cohesive towards a paper. Therefore, as a result, proving that they participated in this kind of process is a huge jump forward for many of these students. And actually, in reality, many of them learn throughout the process and therefore become stronger students regardless. Therefore, as a result, having those research skills can only be beneficial towards a student's long-term purpose in psychology regardless, and also be hugely beneficial towards the admissions process as a whole. Second thing, research allows students to showcase particular interests or skills they gained in the process. This is absolutely hugely important for a significant portion of the student base, because a lot of times they enjoy something. For example, a history student may enjoy history, but he has no evidence whatsoever of his pursuit in history. They didn't work in a museum, or maybe he did other things like that. But beyond that, there's no actual academic support for the kid's love of history besides getting a 5 or 4 in US history. That, unfortunately, is a given for a student that's thinking about going or attending history majors. Unfortunately, accomplishing the bare minimum is not really what majors are looking for. They're looking for a student that has committed further into the field, especially if you're thinking about attending an Ivy League school. Students that get 5s in US history abound, right? They're everywhere, essentially. I mean, look at the numbers for like AP US history and how many students get a 5. Out of that number is well above the number of students that actually enter into any of these Ivy League schools. Therefore, as a result, how many students get into history inside Harvard? You look at that number and you compare it to the number of Ivy League number of US history AP students that get a 5, and you realize very quickly that the number is ridiculously different. Therefore, what else do these students do that prove that they want to be history majors? And honestly, the number one most common methodology to do that is to participate inside research or to work with professors to be able to do this. Therefore, also additional on top of that, this is where research comes into play a little bit even more complexly once you enter into the part where research also provides students opportunities to gain recognition, awards, and opportunities in the future. This is hugely immense if the student has done amazingly well in their research work. particularly in the event that they worked with professors that actually enjoy working with them. When you do really well in research, the number of opportunities they gain oftentimes triple, if not quadruple, because they will be offered opportunities from the professor that are not available publicly. Internships that honestly would never be offered to a high school student suddenly open up to them because the professor offered it to them. Possibilities to work underneath particular employers suddenly open up because the professor said, this student has amazing skills and I want to have him hired underneath my private firm. We've had students literally working under a professor as a high school student get hired by that professor's actual consulting firm. Why? Because his skills in computer science were particularly amazing. Therefore, why is it that we do research? We oftentimes tell students because one way or another, you should have to think about it. So obviously, everyone knows that you could do a research paper underneath the university, but some students even go so far as to do independent research and get their papers published. Additionally, on top of that, others actually go through articles or even work so far to organizations or programs to get their research authenticated and then supported by further professors through an organized system that may be a little bit different from what would be a one-on-one workshop relationship with a professor. Okay, so how to balance extracurriculars with academics. Now that we kind of talk about extracurriculars and the opportunities that you have to think about, and I'm sure people have many questions about this, and don't be afraid to maybe ask inside the chat to my brother, essentially, so he can organize them for me afterwards at the end of the seminar. But for now, essentially, we want to kind of understand how to balance extracurriculars with academics, and when is it too much of an extracurricular or too much work towards extracurriculars versus too much work in academics. So number one, actually going back a little bit, if you don't mind. Oh, no. 1 second, my apologies. Oh, yeah, okay. So number one, when is the best time to start doing extracurriculars? The answer to your question for that one is very easy. As early as possible. You should always do them. So now we go into that one because the rest of them. Okay, so now number one, as we look into this paper, we look very, very quickly, essentially. There's a reason why the UCs and the Common App literally have check marks that talk about essentially whether or not students have done something in 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. The number one most important thing about extracurriculars is how long have you done them and how far have you gone? This happens all the time. This is why we tell students, if you can, please participate in activities as long as you possibly can. Also, you have to realize this. Most people look at this and say, well, that's ridiculous. My child has participated in 4 activities and there's no guarantee that he will end up inside as the president of them. That's the thing. Most students at a young age participate in multiple activities and shave off other ones as they get better at particular ones. And this is a really important caveat that I keep telling students. You cannot try to pinpoint which activity is best for you from the start. Every student changes as years go by. Their interests change, their skills change, who they work with or who they prefer to work with change. Opportunities open up that may completely open up new things that they want to do and they've never done that before or even thought about it. What's one of the most important things to do is to maintain flexibility. And flexibility comes with trying as many activities as physically possible for them while still maintaining their academics and not causing any undue stress, essentially, as they experiment with possibilities. But as every year goes by, they go from 9th grade to 10th grade, essentially opportunities close. And therefore, as a result, to counter that, the students should try as many as they can in freshman year and shave them down as we go towards senior year. Essentially, obviously, is the student going to be able to maintain 8 activities as senior, especially if he's like president over all of them? Impossible. Anyone that tries to do that is deluding themselves at that point. And therefore, as a result, we oftentimes tell students, it's actually important to know how to shave them down as you go, because some students hate to give up things, right? They think that it's like, oh, I put time into this and I don't want to do it. And they fall into a sunk cost fallacy. What you have to understand is that if that sunk cost fallacy costs you your grades, then you're completely not realizing the objective purpose of doing multiple activities at the start. However, many students essentially think, okay, well, as I shave down, which one should I keep? And that is a more nuanced question that essentially is different for every student. And that's something that I work with students all the time. Which ones are worth keeping? Which ones are worth having to drop? Which ones are taking too much time and are not worth the commitment in the first place? We have to see that as we go. And not only that, even the same activity for 2 students at the same year can have vastly different amounts of time commitment for each of them, mostly due to whether or not their position requires that or the expectations of this. A student could be going inside JSA at one point and have 1 hour a week of work. The other student could be in a similar position, but different department and have 5. And therefore, as a result, which one's actually more meaningful could be completely dependent on the student and what major they're choosing at that time. And therefore, as a result, we have to adjust on the fly as we go. Okay, so comparing that to when we have to worry about SAT and ACT, and when do we need to begin preparation? Now, I think I've included this in a little bit earlier, but I mentioned something about SAT and ACT being dependent on the student's math. The reason why I say that is actually dependent on why students have to think about math performance first before they go into English. English is a relatively adaptable field. And to be completely frank and honest, I am the English teacher here. The vast majority of students should have learned most of the grammar rules in their middle school years. Therefore, as a result, being tested on grammar in of itself is actually not supposed to be that difficult. The problem essentially is the poor quality of teaching they received in their middle school years. And therefore, as a result, the lack of comprehension in terms of middle school English grammar that should be relatively inherent to them. Now, obviously, a significant portion of the student body actually understands grammar in the same way that a person may understand how to drive a car, essentially, and that they know how to drive an automatic car, but don't know how to understand the manual stick shift driving system that's necessary for some cars. Therefore, in the same way, students know how to drive their English, but they don't actually understand the intrinsic nature of the grammar rules in which they participate with. Therefore, oftentimes, English is not really the factor that plays a role. And honestly, most students, once they get training in SAT, even as early as freshman year, their English is not really the problem, though English speed reading for reading comprehension could be somewhat of a factor. The biggest factor essentially that completely sinks or essentially accelerates a student's ability within SAT and ACT is almost always math. If they are not at the level where they know the math necessary to complete SAT, it's usually incredibly pointless to submit them through that. They don't know the material, they don't know the math, and therefore as a result, no matter how many times you try to push it onto them, if they don't know how to do it, they don't know how to do it. So unless the student actually understands that they need to know that, or they want to pursue something like Algebra 2 early so they could accommodate for that, maybe the option to open up SAT early becomes possible for them. But if the student doesn't want to do the due diligence necessary to learn the math material required to take SAT and ACT early, at that point, instead, what we have to do is we have to wait until the student is capable of being able to prepare for SAT before we decide to do so. That being said, though, if the student, for example, up until a certain point, essentially doesn't want to study, regardless if they're already taking calculus in their freshman year, they're not going to be able to finish the test. It really is a matter of mental understanding of preparation. If a student doesn't take their personal time to study, they will never increase their score. Some parents will oftentimes go so far as to ask me, what's the fastest I've ever seen a student increase their score to completion and be able to get out of the way? I've seen it happen in 1 month. That student devoted a tremendous amount of his personal time outside of classes, outside of just studying. He used a lot of material. He learned what was necessary from me and finished it in 1 month. Now, do I expect that from all my students? Absolutely not. But do I also know too many students who literally improve their scores dramatically in the last 2 months or 1 month of essentially of constant classes? Some students have been going 2 years essentially doing classes essentially in various places, and they don't get their act together until literally the last 2 months before their final opportunity, and suddenly their score pops up 150 points. If they had just done that a year or two ago, they would have been able to finish it then. But however, the biggest problem essentially is that they're not committed to the idea of completing the test. So that's the most important thing. If the child is willing to complete and willing to finish it and recognize that taking a 3 to 3.5 hour test again and again and again is not something they wish to do, at that point, then they should take the test and get prepared for it. And how long it takes is really a matter of whether or not they shape up at that point. Now, for AP exams, we consistently tell students this. When you need to begin preparation, 100% depends on a combination of many factors. Number one, the first and most important factor is their teacher. The worse their teacher, the faster they need to come in for preparation. If the teacher is not preparing them appropriately at the beginning of the year, do not expect that teacher to suddenly shape up and prepare them in the later end of the year. I've had teachers fail to teach even the most foundational basics for their students starting from the very beginning, and actually fail to do a single essay until the end of the year. Those students needed preparation as early as possible so that we can at least shape up or maintain some level of semblance of control within their learning environment before they decide to go into hard studies. Some students have amazing teachers and only need preparation for maybe a month or two. Some students have difficult teachers and therefore need additional help or assistance outside of just AP prep, and therefore those students may need some assistance. But the most important thing we always tell parents is be flexible. Talk to the students and figure out things, but also understand this. If you hear anything about the student saying, this teacher is incompetent, this teacher has not taught me anything, then you really need to consider whether or not we need to do AP preps early. The reason for that being is that the less preparation they have, the less time they have to be able to get ready for the test. And by the time that they're thinking about doing free response questions and they're already supposed to have known the material and suddenly they're working from behind, they will find themselves completely incapable of actually adapting to what's happening live. So therefore, I keep telling this again and again to students, think about when you need assistance and usually start it a few months earlier. Some students come in 2 months before the test, and I'll tell you this, it usually doesn't go well, especially if they come in 2 months before the test and their teacher hasn't prepared them at all. That's the worst case scenario. Most of my students who succeed in AP exams prepare as early as winter break before, and those students generally tend to do quite well for themselves, even if their teacher has failed to teach them at all. I've had entire students essentially take a class underneath a US history teacher who has completely failed to teach them, and still, because they're prepared as early as winter break, they're able to get 5s on all their exams. That's the foundation of how they do this. And you have to understand essentially that preparation is a factor of time as much as a factor of effort. Okay, so US policy, for example, should I do SAT and ACT? Now, obviously, this is a relatively new development for the vast majority of parents. At this point, for the UCs, they have gone test blind, and other schools, private schools, have gone test optional with very few going test blind. So first things for this, if I wish to go to UCs, do I have to take the SAT and ACT? No. As long as they go test blind, essentially tests are not going to be seen. The UCs have outright stated they will not see SAT and ACT scores if they're submitted to them, regardless if you send them from the College Board. Despite the fact that it's kind of ridiculous that the College Board even has the ability to send scores to UCs in the first place, considering that UCs don't accept them, which is also in a way a very odd money grab. But anyway, that's a caveat. The point essentially is this, is that if you're specifically over to UCs, do you have to take the SAT and ACT? No. However, this is very important to take note. Most schools essentially have gone test optional, which means essentially that test scores are necessary and that they will look at it. And here's the thing, the vast majority of students that have gotten into the schools all had SAT and ACT scores. It is much more likely that a student that didn't have one got in because they had adequate and ample evidence of their academic capability outside of school. And when I mean ample, I mean to the point is almost absurd. Outside of that particular case, unless the student finds themselves completely incapable of getting a decent SAT and ACT score, they should always take the SAT and ACT. Now, if they have attempted to do so and they realize that for their standard average, essentially, student, they are below average in SAT and ACT, and despite their efforts, they can't make it, yes, there may be a case that could be made about, oh, maybe they shouldn't do so. For example, I've had a philosophy student who really struggled to be able to complete the SAT on time due to the fact that he generally tends to think slowly, which makes sense because philosophical students essentially are supposed to think slowly and mule over what they're doing. Therefore, as a result, it was completely impractical for him to go through an SAT and ACT test where he's being tested on his ability to think quickly. Therefore, as a result, despite his best efforts, he couldn't really break the average for his race and for his gender at the time period. Therefore, he can make a case for essentially not submitting his SAT and ACT scores, and he'll still be okay because of his choice of major. However, anyone that tells you that you want to pursue a career in medicine and you don't have to submit an SAT and ACT score essentially is really just blowing smoke at that point. Now, how do I balance a difficult academic workload versus having leadership opportunities or positions, right? We have to understand that the most important thing about this is always the student. As I mentioned this before, it seems like I'm beating a dead horse with this, but essentially it's very different depending on the student, right? Every student essentially has completely different capacities for balancing certain things. Some students are better at their extracurriculars and find it incredibly easy. Other students find their academic loads outlandishly easy and therefore as a result can throw the hardest classes at them and still find it comically easy for them. While other students may find themselves buried underneath the academic loads and therefore as a result, it's not really a wise idea to put them underneath that, right? So every student is different. Therefore, as a result, what is considered difficult for them is again different, and what is considered plausible for them to maintain with an academic and leadership load is again different. Therefore, for example, we oftentimes will have to say it like this: certain activities, just by nature of what they are, require an immense amount of time. A golf athlete who is blue chip or top 25 at one point essentially requires an outlandish amount of time in order to be able to commit to that. Therefore, as a result, is it realistic to expect them to take 5 APs or 6 APs and still maintain those grades while also being top 25 in the nation for golf? Completely impossible, unless they're some incredible genius in terms of the academic load and they find it easy. And this is where some students come into play like this. A good example of this would actually be Jeremy Lin. Jeremy Lin, for example, was able to enter into Harvard as an athletic scholar. He was a top tier basketball athlete, yet he was able to maintain a decent amount of APs and was able to get good scores on them. Why? Because he didn't find those APs quite that difficult, even while maintaining a very, very extensive load. But again, that is 100% dependent on the student and 100% dependent on the school. For example, he wouldn't have taken some of those APs had the teachers been incredibly difficult. He probably would have balanced his course load out differently had certain qualifications for APs been a little bit too much for him to take considering his basketball load. So what we always have to say is be flexible, be realistic. You have to communicate, essentially. If you're a parent, communicate with your child. If you're a student, really be honest with yourself. We have had far too many students essentially think that they could get away with doing too little, essentially. They don't want to work and then they do far less APs than they are fully capable of despite having no extracurricular workload. They just want to avoid work. And there was a result, even though they have 2 to 3 hours of free time every day, they still don't want to do additional opportunities or take up actual academic load. Additionally, we oftentimes have to argue this with parents. Sometimes parents don't see that their students are constantly studying and only notice when they're not. And therefore, as a result, that mental dissonance of what's going on at this point sometimes leads to overwork. We've had students completely bomb classes because realistically, they can't balance 5, 6 APs with their extracurricular course load. So we keep telling parents, you really have to have an honest conversation with them and listen, essentially, when the students do say things. And that really 100% is dependent on the student and the parent relationship. The healthier the relationship, the more you could trust each other. The worse it is, the more you have to be careful at that point, right? And the more someone like myself who essentially had or works to have a good relationship with students is necessary, because then I could talk with them and get an idea of what makes sense with them. This is unfortunately one of the aspects where parenting a child essentially becomes difficult. Most counselors essentially even have counselors for their kids because they can't seem to get that communication network with them and be 100% honest with each other. So that's just part of how things are, unfortunately. Now, one thing I do want to state, there is the possibility where a student may take academic activities that do synergize with their academic course load. In those cases, essentially, it is possible that, for example, they may be able to balance a wider academic or extracurricular course load that otherwise most students can do. We see this commonly with STEM students who, for example, participate in academic decathlon or science bowl, who have to study biology anyway, and therefore, as a result, their AP bio studies tend to somehow become easier. Chemistry students who are participating in the chemistry Olympiad end up finding AP Chem quite easy because they're studying incredibly difficult material. So there is some level of where you can find natural synergies and then try to hit 2 birds with 1 stone with an activity at the same time. But those things are essentially 100% also dependent on the opportunities available at school. Trying to do chemistry Olympiad solo without a coach essentially is a relatively fruitless endeavor. So telling people to do that is not really the best way to do things. However, essentially, if that is an opportunity and they want to go into STEM and they're taking AP Chem, why not try to hit 2 birds with 1 stone? So now we're entering into the part that a lot of people have been waiting for. We're talking about case studies. Now, before I go forward, essentially, what is a case study? So that some parents who may not know. A case study is a case where we have students who have already entered into schools, essentially, and this is the information that they provided either publicly or through us, and therefore as well gave us permissions to provide that publicly to other students. Essentially, these are all cases where students are already there. Now, duly note though, that this is the most important thing. Do not think that if you imitate someone precisely and therefore do exactly what they have done, essentially, that means that you get into the school. This is actually one of the biggest myths that parents perpetuate all the time. They try to imitate that one friend who has a kid who got into school this way. Do not try that. It doesn't work. Every student is different, and that student, the more apart they are, the more, actually, to be completely honest, we've seen complete siblings not be able to repeat the things of their older sibling because they don't want to repeat the things of their older sibling. And it could be as simple as that, right? Telling one sibling to copy their older brother or older sister if they don't want to is actually an incredibly fruitless endeavor, especially if they have a bad relationship with each other. And even if they have a good relationship, if they just don't want to be the same as their older sibling, sometimes that just doesn't work. So therefore, as a result, please understand that case studies are just that. They're a case study where we look at them, we learn what may work and what doesn't. Essentially, we could take certain lessons from them and see that this is what's the possibilities. And therefore, as a result, take those and apply what we learn from these case studies towards your own child. So we start with a student from Berkeley. Now, obviously from the very beginning, you can already see this student already has a very, very long list of activities done and is particularly different from most other students. Now, first thing we have to know, the student is a liberal arts student. However, there's a very important caveat to this. The student actually is a history and environmental science major. Now, what we do need to note is that you cannot become a science major if you don't do certain things that indicate what you want to do. Now, we also know, for example, that this person was a Chinese male student. He goes and attends a public school. His family makes above 100K income, and this actually is very important. This means that he pays full tuition. Unfortunately, the competitive edge for students that actually make a lot is actually a little bit less than necessarily a student that may have to have full tuition or do these kind of things. However, overall as a whole, they are also weighed heavier because as a student with discretionary income, they are expected to have participating opportunities available to them at a higher level than maybe a student who cannot pursue those opportunities. A student whose family makes less than 40K is not expected to have the large array of academic extracurricular activities, essentially, as a student that is whose family is well off, essentially, in the middle school area with large numbers of opportunities. Now, that's not necessary to say that a student with a 40K income essentially is directly compared to a student with a 100K income. If anything, most of the time, the reason why students essentially are compared against each other from like larger financial backgrounds is due to the fact that they're usually from the same region. Therefore, students are oftentimes compared within their own zip code or compared within their own school district. And therefore, as a result, it's more likely that a person of financial status of a certain area will be compared against their peers. And therefore, as a result, this leads to further competition. So first thing we need to check for, SAT at 1470. The student at the time period is actually a little bit higher than average. However, for Chinese Asian male, not necessarily the highest for a science student. So there's some level of like, okay, well, what did this guy do that may have unintentionally pushed and boosted him to get into this major? We look at his other exams. Psychology for a 5, music theory is a 5, Chinese language is a 5, which honestly doesn't really have that much of an impact, but his environmental science is a 5 as well, and human geo. Notice that, for example, that he does follow under and pretty much provide information to the school that, yes, I am actually a humanities student that has some specialization towards environmental sciences. And that is further supported by essentially his published research articles. If you don't do such things, right, claiming that you enjoy the environment means nothing if you don't have supporting evidence. And it's obvious that the student has a tremendous amount of it. He did publish research articles. He wrote research papers on classifying specific ethnic minorities in Southwest China. Notice how both of his research papers are related to the majors they applied for. Therefore, as a result, going into his IB research paper, we see history of water pollution, analyzing Chinese government of biological treatment of pollution. These are all science and related to history. Therefore, as a result, him choosing to go with that major makes sense with his CV. You look at his curricula vitae and you see 100%, this guy actually wants to do it. That's one thing that we keep emphasizing to people. You cannot apply for a major outside of this. This is actually one of the things where we have students do really odd stuff. Because they're afraid of coming across as a medical student, they do years of medical school research essentially and then apply as like a sociology major. Why? That doesn't necessarily work. Yes, while being pre-med essentially is an incredibly difficult major to get into, it doesn't make sense if you don't have supporting evidence from your curricula vitae or your resume that states outright that, yes, I actually want to study sociology. At the same time, on the reverse side of this, we have so many students do humanities work and then try to apply for pre-med. Of course, they're not going to get in. Everyone that's applying for pre-med, it has tons of research opportunities that outright state that I literally did neurobiological research, or I worked on CRISPR, or I did data analysis for like neurogenetic research or cancer research. All these students do all these things essentially related to the major they want to do, and that reflects inside all the activity choices, right? If your plan is to apply for a major that's a little bit easier to get in, then you need your extracurriculars to reflect that as well, right? Now, going into the next part, this student, even as a result, even with all these things, was also the first flute inside his school. He published music compositions and he did poetry. Now, as a result of this, we look at all these opportunities and we see, yes, he's a very well-rounded student, but even in his well-rounded nature, he still did specifics that indicate he wants to do environmental science. Therefore, as a result, it's okay for him to apply to environmental sciences and for that to work out. Okay, now we're going to a UPenn student. So this student essentially was a Korean male who also attended a public school, and his family was somewhat financially well off. However, essentially we look at what his other scores were. He had a 1500. So actually for UPenn male Korean student, his average was actually a little lower than most of their students. Additionally, on top of that, we could look at his GPA and say that, oh, his GPA is quite high. However, his AP scores weren't exactly all the best. Calculus was a 4, US history was a 4, AP language was a 4, biology was a 3, AP world history was a 4. We see all these things and we see, hey, you know what? He didn't have the best out there. Now, this is a very important thing to remember. This student's school didn't have the best record of AP scores in the first place. Therefore, in context of the fact that his whole class didn't get a 5 and that he was one of the only kids that got a 4 in history, even though he applied for history to UPenn, it was okay because he did okay compared to his peers. And this is a lesson that we keep repeating to people. Whether or not a student needs to get a 5 in order to get into an Ivy League school is actually dependent on the rest of his classmates. Now, if he's the only one that got a 4 when most of the top tier students in this class got 5s, he's in trouble. Now, if he's the only student that got a 4 when everyone else got 3s, then we have another lesson altogether. Therefore, as a result, again, these things are all subjective. We keep telling people this essentially that yes, obviously we want students to get the highest score possible, but that's not always really required or necessary if the school at that point may not be quite as good. But you have to realize this, a school that's not quite as good as that means that the student may suffer in other academic fields or lack of opportunities that essentially are not available had he gone to, that would have been available had he gone to a better school. So we always have to take the cons with the pros, right? Additionally, on top of that, this student essentially made up for his lack of opportunities in his area by doing other things. Notice, for example, that because his school wasn't really that great, look at the other things he did. He was a research assistant at the university, where he worked on a paper underneath the professor. He actually was also a museum curator. He worked on the school board of his school area. He was a science Olympiad team captain because, well, to be honest, even though he was a history major, he was actually better than most of his other peers at science regardless. Therefore, as a result, he was making do with what he had available to him. Additionally, on top of that, he was a high school varsity team player, model UN vice president. He did so many other things because, well, to be honest, the opportunities available to him were relatively minimal. Therefore, he had to work. And therefore, as a result, despite his school background, he was able to make it into UPenn. So this is the thing that we keep telling students. It's all about comparison. You have to understand what your peers are doing. But here's the thing. Most of the time, students in your particular school may not be sharing what they're doing at any time. Therefore, as a result, the better your school is, the more likely you have to be competitive with them and the more you need to think about what you're doing at a period of time. Now, going into an Emory student, we look at this essentially, we see a white male who attended public school. And here's the thing. One of the first things you have to understand is very different. This student got a 35 in ACT, but was also a varsity football athlete. That should tell you something already that is a little bit different. Now, additionally on top of that, while his scores are essentially a little bit fluctuative, he did have mostly 5s and 4s. So at this point, we look at this and say, hey, look at his activities. He doesn't really have as much. Is that really necessary? Because remember, this guy was a varsity football athlete. It is not normal for a varsity football athlete to have this many clubs. To be completely honest, he actually had more than the average number of athletes available in his area. And not only that, because he was offensive guard, we have to say that in comparison to his peers, he actually was doing quite well for himself. So you have to realize this. Again, we always have to think and emphasize the fact that like students, essentially, everyone's different. If we take away his football, would he have been able to get into Emory? To be completely honest, probably not. However, essentially, we see that in context of his athletic career, in context of how he's done and his very, very good essays, we could say, for example, with confidence that the student deserved to get in because he was spending hours every day in football while still maintaining really, really good AP scores, maintaining strong science extracurriculars. And even though he may not have participated in as many different outside extracurriculars as some of his peers who went to science, he got into a better school than many of them because, well, he was doing football while still maintaining all these things. So he's better balancing out his time than some of them were. Okay, now, obviously we wanted to go into Harvard. So now my brother and I both attended this school, but duly note though, this is not our case profile. So please do not misconstrue that. Essentially, we have a different student altogether. Now, this student is essentially is an Indian female, attends a private school in India. Now, duly note though, the reason why we put a student that's international in here is due to the fact that the vast majority of students eventually who participate internationally are put under a harder level of scrutiny than necessarily a student that's local. So this level is going to be a little bit higher than maybe expected, but it should also give you a clue as to what to expect from these students. Now, first things first, this person got in for mathematics and economics. That is outrageous, by the way. Mathematics and economics is one of the most competitive fields for Harvard at any given period of time. And therefore, as a result, knowing that the student got in for that means that they must have done amazing things. Additionally, on top of that, they have an SAT score of 1510. Now, most students essentially will look at this and be like, wait, no, I know people who got into Harvard, they mostly got 1550, 1560. This is where we have to tell people, it's not always about the SATs. Now, that being said, though, getting an SAT score and doing well in it is less required than it was before. However, getting a good score is still a really nice thing to do. Additionally, on top of that, what we oftentimes say is that for now, due to the nature of COVID, the competitiveness of SAT has dipped a bit. Therefore, as a result, it is more likely you see students in the last year getting with 1510 than necessarily you would have seen 3 years ago. 3 years ago, getting with a 1510 is relatively anomalous. Therefore unlikely. But from what we see so far, this is not too bad. Also, you have to realize this, the student was an international Indian student and they got 790 in math. They got 720 in English. So there's a little bit of excuse given to them, essentially considering that their first language may not be English at this time period. Additionally, on top of that, look at their AP exam. They got 4 and a 5 in psychology and AP stats. Do not misunderstand though. They took every possible AP exam and class available at their school. They just didn't get their scores due to the fact that the IB's exams do not finish and complete until after their senior year in high school. Therefore, as a result, we do not have the data for the IB scores that they got at that particular moment. However, what did they do outside of that? Despite pursuing mathematics and economics, they spent a significant portion of time going to Model United Nations, going to student council, going to statistics. They even worked at a firm. This is like hugely important. Most people will look at this and be like, oh, they're Model United Nations president. No, the thing that really clinched them was a statistics analysis firm. If they got a recommendation letter from their firm that's supported by data that shows what they worked on, that is way more important towards getting in for a mathematics economics degree at Harvard than almost anything else on this CV. Therefore, as a result, we often tell, but then that being said, though, how do they flesh themselves out? Because they worked at a girls' orphanage, because they worked as a woman in STEM club. And this is, by the way, hugely important as an Indian woman due to the fact that oftentimes women in STEM are mistreated in the country of India. Therefore, it is very likely she mentioned multiple times in her essays, essentially, that she was struggling with the inherent sexist environment that she was working against and therefore wants to come into America to work in this area. It's likely that she did that and also received scholarships for high achievements. Therefore, as a result, she was given some leeway because as a woman from India, she is subject to a significant amount of prejudice. Therefore, essentially, she succeeded despite that and therefore was able to use that as further evidence to prove that she deserved to go. And therefore, as a result, she received an acceptance as a result of that. Okay, so now that we're done with this for now. We're going to go into the question and answering session. I'm sure we have a significant number of questions from parents or anyone that's asking for things. Duly note, though, that essentially it will be a little bit difficult for me to answer personalized questions, essentially, because I may not be able to respond directly about personal information about a student, or, for example, offer something that's immediately pertinent to a student's needs at the particular moment. But I'll do my best to answer questions as they come.
Okay, I'll give about a minute or two to let people type. Please do send them to Brian O. It's under the Zoom chat system. So feel free to ask any questions you have, and I'll go ahead and read them off along the way. I'll give about a minute. Okay, so the first question that was asked is this, is that all of the case studies presented from the Royal Education Center students?
So first things first is that unfortunately, due to privacy reasons, I can't really disclose exactly which students essentially are ours and which ones are from outside. But duly note though that yes, the vast majority are our students essentially. I can't tell you which ones are which, but therefore, however, most of them are.
Okay. The next question that was asked is, what kind of research opportunities should someone interested in medicine look for?
Okay, so research in this kind of situation, as a result of the second part of the question, it's honestly pretty obvious. Due to research opportunities, you should at least do research opportunities in STEM. However, essentially, medically oriented research opportunities are few and far in between. Therefore, as a result, if they can do so, that's absolutely obviously the best answer to that. So if they want to pursue a career in pre-med or to, for example, participate in particular majors in pre-med, they should do research that is pertinent toward that direction. However, which skills they develop during those internships could play a factor in how they approach essentially medicine. Therefore, as a result, in today's day and era, significant portion of students actually participate in computer science to be able to get into medical internship. However, essentially in the nature of doing computer science, they eventually realize they prefer that field and go in that direction, which has happened a few times with some of our students. However, in terms of pre-med, essentially, if you specifically want to go that direction, often, honestly, pre-med oriented internships or pre-med oriented research papers will always be preferable if you wish to pursue that exact direction. However, again, there's a lot of caveats to all of this.
The next question, I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. I'm guessing the parents asking, what about for students that decide to apply undecided for their major? Like,
okay.
Yeah.
So in actuality, there's actually a lot of students that do apply for undecided. And to be completely honest, this actually plays into the thing where I talked about with some students essentially applying outside of their major or doing something relatively random. If the student's extracurricular activity load and class load looks like an undecided student, it makes sense for them to apply undecided. However, if you have a very particularly clear-cut resume that clearly states, I want to do pre-med, and then you apply undecided for sciences, they're gonna know. And they're going to look at you with suspicion, essentially. And in actuality, that might be a demerit against you because they don't think you're being honest, essentially. So we oftentimes tell people, if you want to be undecided, it should reflect inside your overall career. You might want to try this and do that, and then try that, and then do that. And then therefore, as a result, once your major is chosen, you say, I want to be undecided. They look at it and say, yep, this looks like an undecided student. He tried public health and he tried it like history and he worked inside like this job and did everything. So he kind of is not sure if he wants to do business, medicine, or this. Yeah. So if you're like a well-rounded student that's incredibly well-rounded, right? Essentially, it does make sense to be like that.
Okay. The next question, do you recommend any research opportunities, organizations, and what is the best way to find community service opportunities?
Okay. So particularly when it comes down to internships, unfortunately, that really actually depends on the student. So for example, it depends on the year, depends on when they're applying and what APs they have. You know, for example, I could recommend Cosmos, but if they didn't take certain AP courses, there's no reason for them to apply there because they wouldn't get in. So in reality, essentially, unfortunately, which choice of programs they should be applying to may change rapidly depending on the situation. Also, yeah, by the way, if you want to ask questions, please ask to Brian, but I'll just, answer yours right afterwards. But one of the, so as a result of this, students, for example, will have to have their internships relatively personalized. Otherwise, there's going to be a relatively fruitless endeavor. Therefore, in oftentimes case, we have to prepare as far as early as freshman year to see, hey, what math level should they be at before they sign up for an internship? What internship should they be thinking about? What level of computer science knowledge do they have before they want to be talking to professors or doing these kind of things? So there's a lot of these caveats that first must be addressed before they think about what's optimal. So I'm going to answer this question before. So someone asked, you said it's not necessary to send SAT report to UCs because they are test blind. Is that correct? Yes. So unfortunately, no matter, even if you do send UC SATs to UCs, essentially, they will not take it. Due to the fact that they've officially announced themselves as test blind, essentially, there's no way for you to actually report your SAT score within the UC app. Additionally, on top of that, even sending it to them, they will not send it to any other schools. So normally, underneath the SAT protocol, what you would do is you would send an SAT score to one UC and they will copy it and send it to the rest of UCs. Unfortunately, they have completely shut that off. Therefore, even if you do send it, they will never see it and they're not supposed to actually reveal it. because unfortunately, to be completely honest, they've been sued by essentially a multitude of families within California that said that the College Board has not done due diligence to allow special needs students to have access to the SAT. And therefore, the result of that lawsuit, the UCs have been forced to go test blind. So if they have been proven to still use tests, they'll be sued again. So they have gone test blind as a result of it. Another question?
Nope, there's no other questions at the moment. I'll just give another minute or so for people to send any last bit questions and so on.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, please, feel free to ask any questions. I'm more than happy to try to help out as best as I possibly can. But yes, if you're unsure about some of the information I provided before, then feel free to ask away.
Oh, there's an interesting, very specific question. So the individuals asking that specifically at their school, there's a director who talked about how like basically a person, in order to get accepted to a highly selected school, students need to take 12 AP exams. Do you agree?
So this may be a reflection of the individual campus, essentially. So, for example, if you go to a high school where the average number of students who get into the top tier schools average about 12 APs, then yes, that would be somewhat similar or somewhat true. However, to think that any top tier college may have a selective process where they say you cannot get into it, essentially, or you cannot come into the school if you have like 11 APs, essentially it's completely false. We literally, even right now, as we look at like varsity athletes and students, we see varsity athletes with, minimal APs get in because of recruitment and things like this. So remember, there's always a caveat and always a case to everything. However, if you're thinking about a stereotypical student entering into a school, essentially like Harvard or Stanford, and therefore as a result, the average for students that get into those schools is 12 APs, disregarding maybe caveats like varsity, then yes, it would be somewhat true essentially, but it's not set in stone. Okay, does anyone else have other questions?
We're giving another minute or two.
I gotta answer as many as necessary, really. No, okay. So just want to say, again, my name is Albert. Thank you everybody for coming in and attending today's seminar. I hope what I provided was definitely very informative, and I'm sure many people will probably ask me questions later with their child or as a result of emails or anything like that. So please feel free to contact us essentially as necessary. Always remember that, as a result, you got my brother and my email. So therefore, as a result, if you guys have any questions, feel free to email us essentially anything you may have. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. Again, hope everyone has an amazing day and visit us at royaled.net. Essentially, please email Brian if you have any further inquiries, and therefore as a result, we shall have a nice day. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Everyone have a nice day now.